I'm Jim Keown. I've been a member at Central since 1985 and have seen a lot of changes, and I want to talk something about tradition and how we get caught in doing some things a certain way for no particular reason maybe. A case in point is I was at a church in northern Indiana and I was a speaker, and they had communion, and I looked at the bulletin and there was no hint as to how they did communion. So I looked at an older lady that was sitting in the second row and nobody around her, and I thought I'd just watch her and then pick up the clue on how I'm supposed to do communion. Do we pick up the emblems and hold it, or do we take them as they're passed to us? So I watched her, and when the communion came, she picked it up and held it in her hand, and then she took the cup and held it in her hand. And so I thought, well, that's a clue. So when they got to me, I did the same thing, except that I noticed as we went through the communion service, people were partaking as they received it. So when we got to the end, I was still holding the bread and the cup as she was. Later on, I found out that she was a visitor and she didn't know any more about what was going on than I did. So my first Sunday at Central Christian Church, I sat in about the third or fourth pew back from the front, and I was in the center section by the braces or that go up through the middle of the center section, and I was right up by it. So we took communion. They passed the bread to me, and everybody partook. And I tried to hand it to the person next to me on my left, and they wouldn't take it. And I couldn't understand what was going on. They finally signaled to me I was supposed to pass it back to the aisle. So the tradition at that point was that they passed the bread just to the center, and then it went back to the aisle, and then we would pass the cup to the center, and it would go back to the aisle. And so I finally learned that was an unspoken tradition, and because nobody said anything about it, and it was very confusing to a visitor. Mm-hmm. Well, I explored communion after that a little bit to see how things were done at Central, and I found out that there was a difference between being a deacon and an elder as to what you could do in the communion service. The deacons would work in the preparation room. They would polish the communion ware. They would fill the cups and prepare everything, and then they left it alone. They were not allowed to carry it into the sanctuary and put it on the communion table. That was a job for the elders to do. So I'd been back there watching, and I noticed that some elders would get in a hurry, and they would sit on the steps that took you upstairs to the balcony and look at the deacons and try to hurry them up because they wanted to get the communion out there. Well, so that was a tradition. When it was prepared, the elders would come in, put on white silk gloves, pick up the communion ware, and take it all the way into the sanctuary and properly set it on the communion table, measuring the distance from each point so that they were centered correctly. Mm-hmm. And so that was an interesting part of it, is the preparation and the setting of the communion ware. Then I found out another interesting thing, and that was that at that point, they had 6 deacons that would line up in the front. And 2 of the deacons were designated as pivot deacons. And that meant that the elders, when they passed out the bread and the cup, they would only communicate and hand stuff to the pivot deacon. The pivot deacon then would turn and hand it to deacon number 2, and then that deacon number 2 would hand it to deacon number 3. And that's the way that they would hand out the emblems. And I thought, well, that was strange, because the elders acted as though the other deacon number 2 and 3 on each side weren't even there. They never looked at them. They never handed them anything. They never received back anything. Because after they had served the communion and brought it back, they did the same thing. The pivot deacon is the one that would return the emblems to the elder, and they would pass them down. In my investigation, I found out that that was a long-standing tradition, and it started when the church used to be completely filled, and they may have had as many as 10 deacons up in front. And so they would always just give it to the pivot, and then it get passed down the line. But once it shrunk down to where we had only 6 deacons, they followed the same tradition. And so it was interesting that it was after Linda came and Olita was chair of the deacons that they finally changed that policy and decided that the elders ought to hand the emblems to each of the deacons and do away with this pivot thing. And so they did, and made it much smoother. And we quit passing to the middle and then back because it took too much time. There was no reason why we couldn't go all the way across the center section. Why they ever did it that way, I don't know, unless there was a period of time of where people were scattered and maybe it was more convenient to do that. I don't know what the reason was, and nobody else knew what the reason was. So it just became a long-standing tradition that nobody understood how it ever got started and why we continued it. But we did get it changed, and it went before the board, and the board approved of the elders relating to each of the deacons standing up in front. Well, today we have discovered there are some traditions we need to wipe away, and there's some traditions that are still meaningful, and we keep them. And so, and today we've made a lot of changes, and we've done things differently, and I'm very happy about it, that we're very much open to change. And I don't want to imply that the church was not friendly back in those days when I first started, because we had 3 or 4 families that always made it a point to greet any visitor or any new person that came into the church. So it's always been a friendly congregation. We just had some long-standing traditions that had lost their meaning.